Hi, Margaret. Thanks so much for joining the show today. Can
Glad
you,
to be here.
thank you. Can you give the audience a little bit on your background in UX?
Sure. My name is Margaret Lee, and most recently I was the UX director for a program called UX Community and Culture at Google. I was at Google for about over 14 years, and I'd done a number of different roles at Google. I spent quite a long time, like 9 years, working on Google Maps, but I also touched on search and Chrome, and like I said, the community and culture program. Yeah, I've been at this since I like to say the dawn of the consumer internet, in the mid 90s. So
You sounds like you were working on mainly B2C facing products at Google.
mostly, yeah, on
Yeah,
the consumer side, I was, yeah.
yeah, sweet. And you touched on culture there. How did you see UX and culture, and how did that evolve over the time while you were there?
It evolved a great deal, and it's something I actually really enjoyed talking about internally when I was at Google, talking about the evolution of not just Google, but of UX as a discipline within Google and the culture of user experience. And to sort of paint a picture of what 2007 was like, we were still doing some dial-up, bandwidth was constrained.
Wow.
So it was still largely desktop focused. Designers were coding, everything was just a lot more nascent back then, right? And so
Yeah,
if you think about like where we are today and think about like the delta between 2007 and where we are today, a lot has happened, right? So you can imagine just the pieces that had to come into place in order for that to happen. The types of design experiences that we could dive into, completely different today than they were in 2007, just in terms of not just surfaces, but the fact that like a lot of user experience doesn't even involve surfaces anymore, So it's fascinating to me. And to me, that was part of why I wanted to dive into community and culture at Google and to really intentionally focus on that, because you could just see culture was going to happen no matter what.
yeah,
And the community existed no matter what, but you could either sort of intentionally work with that or just let it continue to organically go whichever way it was going to go.
yeah. No, that sounds like an interesting opportunity. And how big was that design team when you started, and where is it at now? I'm sure that grew
Yeah.
quite a
When I
bit.
when I started in March of 2007, I think it was about 120 people,
Okay.
in UX, and in comparison, I think Google was around 10,000. And I believe I just left, like my official last day was actually yesterday at
Oh, wow.
Google. Yeah.
Congrats.
Yeah. And I think it was close to 5,000 UX or
That's
so,
insane.
right? And I think the company is like at 140,000. So, the scale is just exponential. And
What
yes,
was the intent of
yeah.
culture and community, and how do you measure something like growth of a culture, or an innovative design community? How do you uh,
Super great question.
yeah.
Yeah. And one that we grappled with quite a lot, because, Google is a very data centric company, as you
Yeah.
know, in many ways. And measuring success was always something that, we tried to figure out for something that was so ambiguous in many ways, right?
Right.
And our users were basically ourselves. We were the community serving itself. Um, and we weren't doing the traditional product development process, right? Like we didn't have metrics that were, largely accepted by everybody, like 7-day actives or whatever, Um, and so we kind of had to figure it out. And I would talk to other functions that did similar aspects to the different programs that we were doing. So for example, we focused a lot on training and development, because we really wanted to invest in the people that were already there, right?
Hmm.
And so I would talk to the learning and development folks and ask them, like, how do you measure, your success? And everybody pretty much told me, like, there are these measures. You can measure engagement of how many people, take a class, and then what they rate, the class in this post-class survey and all that.
Yeah.
And those are kind of the accepted ones, but really they were saying it's really hard to measure, because ultimately what you're trying to do is say, how does that affect the actual end goal of the product that they're working on? And there's so many things that play into what goes into a product.
Yeah.
It's really hard to draw the line between like something that we did in an event or a training or whatever into like, oh, that translated to the success of this product. It's really far.
Yeah, the correlate and prove causation of a training influencing something, it sounds pretty hard, but that doesn't, I mean, it's definitely a very measurement driven company, but just because you can't measure something like culture doesn't mean it's not valuable. So how did you grapple with that? Like, clearly there's value in that, and that's a huge reason why people join a company like that.
Yeah. I mean, luckily people did recognize like there's value in this. And you know, when you think about something like culture, it can encompass so many different things. And so really just strategically what we tried to do was like, we need to make sure that we can show progress on some key things when we first started. Like the program started in late 2016. And so it wasn't too hard for us to identify like things that we could do because we were already doing them in our 20% time. And so it was things like what I consider now are like these sort of change management initiatives, right? So for example, you know, we were talking about how UX had to evolve as a discipline, right? In order to actually be able to deliver on the types of experiences that technology was increasingly making possible. And so that meant we had to define new job ladders. We had to make changes to our hiring process so that we could attract different types of talent. All that kind of stuff is like these big change management initiatives where you have to affect parts of the company cultures.
When you were doing this and pushing the envelope and creating, you know, Google's creating material design, really kind of creating a design org that other organizations look up to. And it's easy now to look up to, oh, what does Google call this person, this product designer? What does Google's JD look like? What design system are they? But obviously, you know, who did you guys look up to when you were doing that? Because from our perspective, it looks like you were pushing the envelope into new levels of organizational maturity. But was there another company or an individual that you looked up to and saying, oh, that's how they're doing it, maybe we should take some inspiration from that?
You know, we tried not to slavishly copy, you know, just one company or whatever, or just one thinker of how, whoever, you know, but we tried to survey the landscape pretty much and figure out like, what's the trend, you know, because my philosophy, and I think that's worked well with working on community culture, is like everything's a system, no matter if it's a small system or a big system. And, you know, whatever we're doing fits into the system. So, you know, just paying attention to the different parts, like, you know, what are the other big companies doing, whether it was Facebook, Amazon, Apple, whatever, right? Medium-sized companies, what were they doing? And you could sort of start to see what the trends were. But we also just really had to do a lot of soul searching on like, okay, are we changing for the sake of keeping up with what it seems like the trends are? Because some of it might a little be self-referential, like we're all just sort of following each other's trends, you know? But,
especially in 2007, I would picture Google as an engineering-led organization. The founders were still there. And then now, I mean, it probably still is, but I'd almost argue it's a lot of the parts of it are design driven. How did that play out over the time you were there? And is that true? That's just kind of appears.
It is easier to see in retrospect too, than when you're like living it, you know, but there's so many different sort of milestones. You know, I actually used to give this talk internal to Google. It was called the Unauthorized Biography of Google UX. And I would sort of irreverently capture all these stories and tell it. Because you could see certain times in our history where it was like, you could see like, okay, that was a milestone that made it shift. So I don't think it was like any one thing, but it was definitely an evolution. Like you could see part of it was just technology, right? Like when mobile came out and smartphones came out, that necessitated us to really think a lot differently about the type of design that we were doing and the skill sets that we would need to bring in to basically design for mobile. So I think that that was one big milestone. I think another one was, quite frankly, when Larry became CEO, and that was around 2011, because, you know, he very consciously, I don't know if you remember Kennedy design, the Kennedy redesign, that was like the next year, but that was basically like kind of the first big redesign that Google did. It was still focused on desktop at the time. I'll say it was largely kind of more of a visual reskin because it was desktop.
Yeah.
But it was the first real attempt at like bringing the suite of Google products into visual alignment.
What type, I know you're coaching executives, but what type of advice would you have for some new entrants to the field, new UX designers?
You know, it's like when you're new to anything, to me, that's the best time because you're so open, you're like a sponge. It's like, you know, when you first start a new job, you're really open and you're willing to kind of just soak it all in. I think take the best of that and see how you can carry that forward, because it's so easy to get into the locked and loaded mode really quickly, you know? And a lot of times, you know, the coaching thing is helping to get back to that phase of like, you know, kind of beginner's mind, right? So like,
yeah,
how could you think about this situation differently? And I think that the beauty of people new, you know, to design is that they're so willing, you know, to be thinking about things in all sorts of ways, and they're very open to, you know, hopefully very open to feedback. So I think really carrying those things forward, even as you become more seasoned, you know, how do you stay really open to feedback? How do you continue to seek out different perspectives on your work or how it could inform your work? Because it's going to continue to evolve. You're never going to perfect whatever it is that you're doing. And that's the fun part, because it would get boring if you just figured it out and then it'd be like, okay, what's next, right?